From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, flying humanoids. Here's what's happening. Well, as you know by now, tragedy in Israel. Israel's defense minister has now ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip following the unprecedented incursion into Israel by Hamas fighters. Israel formally declared war on Sunday, gave the green light for significant military steps to retaliate against Hamas for the surprise attack. So far, more than 1,200 people have been killed, thousands wounded on both sides. 11 Americans are dead. The defense minister's announcement came as Israel's military scoured the country south for Hamas fighters and guarded breaches in its border fence with tanks while pounding Gaza from the air. A spokesperson said the Israeli military regained control of border communities taken by Hamas fighters during the attack, but Palestinian militants continue firing barrages of rockets, setting off air raid sirens in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Now, Israel is known to have among the most advanced technological information systems on the planet that are specifically designed to help warn them in advance of planned outside attacks. Yet these systems appear to have failed catastrophically in advance of Saturday's horrendous attacks, leading to the current massive conflict. Let's ask our expert, Lauren Weinstein, how this kind of technology could fail so badly. Lauren, how did this all happen?
Well, I think we need to begin by being very clear that anything said now about the possible technology and related causes in these respects must, of course, be considered to be purely speculative, because this horrific situation has just begun, and it'll be some time before there will be enough public information to have any kind of detailed understanding. But given that Israel is generally acknowledged to have advanced world-class information gathering and analysis capabilities, there are some known classes of patterns that are possibilities, and notably, these patterns also could easily affect the U.S. and many other countries. Now, we know that over-reliance on technology can cause a lack of attention sometimes to human intelligence assets, but Israel is known for leadership in both of those areas, so that's less likely an issue here. But one known class of vulnerabilities of these advanced data information systems is that in a strange kind of way, they work too well. That is, they collect so much data, so much information, and by the way, data and useful information are not necessarily the same thing, that the sheer volume of data information that they can provide are like a massive fire hose running 24/7. And with such an enormous volume present, being able to usefully analyze it for important and actionable information is an enormous task. Now, as the volume increases, it becomes more and more likely that some things important, sometimes critically important, might slip through unnoticed, especially if your adversaries are perhaps purposely feeding misinformation and disinformation into that stream. Now, of course, disinformation, misinformation tactics are probably as old as mankind one way or another. One obvious example is how false information was disseminated about the upcoming D-Day invasion during World War II to suggest to Germany that the invasion would actually occur somewhere other than where it actually did. And today, obviously, the possibilities to essentially automatically create misinformation and disinformation on a gigantic scale exist, helping to overwhelm the ability of both humans and the computers they use to analyze such a gigantic flood for the clues that might actually help military planners and leaders focus their defenses appropriately or take other preparations or actions. So it's an enormously complex situation. And once again, very important, the U.S. and other countries with advanced technologies are certainly vulnerable to these and other related scenarios as well. And even as AI techniques are increasingly being brought to bear on all sides of these issues, this still remains a long-term problem. There are definitely no easy solutions, and this is something we're going to be dealing with for a very, very long time to come.
Absolutely. There'll be a lot of analysis with this, Lauren, after this thing dies down, I hope. And before we continue with the rest of the news, I did want to say this. Everybody here at Coast to Coast has been in shock over this over the past couple days. Our deepest condolences to those victims, those family members who are involved in this situation in Israel. And that includes the good Palestinian people who have been caught up in this mess as well with their militants. There are a lot of good people on both sides, folks. And hopefully one day they will come to the forefront and get this stuff resolved. People dug through the rubble of the earthquake in western Afghanistan for their few possessions, but the material losses seemed unimportant. Saturday's 6.3 magnitude quake killed and injured thousands in Afghanistan when it leveled untold number of homes there. Domino's is now giving customers the opportunity to take part in new emergency pizza programs for those times when most needed. The Domino Emergency Program offers customers a free medium two-topping pizza that can be used whenever they deem necessary. How about that? And here's Dr. Sky Stephen Cates with us with today's weekly report on what's going on up there. Hi, Stephen.
Well, hello there, George. We begin in space, closer to home, but interesting enough, we find out the FCC issues its first fine in space under its anti-space debris rule regarding a satellite known as EchoStar 7. This appears, George, to be as the first time a fine like this was leveled in space. They issued a $150,000 fine to Dish because of a failure, as they claim, to move a satellite, the EchoStar 7, to a higher orbit from its existing orbit in space. The spacecraft was deactivated back in May of 2022, and to avoid the further problem, the growing big problem of space debris, Dish allegedly put it up to about 75 miles above the Earth, but indeed, they wanted it to be much higher, and the government wanted up to 186 miles. But we find out the problem in this particular perspective. According to reliable space agencies, they claim that there are more than 25,000 pieces of space debris, George, larger than 4 inches in diameter in orbit. And putting that in further perspective, a particle the size of a small chip of paint traveling at 17,000 miles an hour can cause fatal effects on any spacewalkers outside a spaceship. We know that low Earth orbit is very crowded. But we move to the powerhouse of the solar system, the sun, George. We talk about the sun's magnetic field about to flip. Well, the sun may be about to flip, but its magnetic field is what we're talking about. This is common on the sun every 11 years or so. Many people may not realize that, but not so on the Earth, which undergoes those magnetic reversals around every 300,000 years, and it has much more serious effects for the Earth. But scientists say that the reversal is near as we reach the peak of sunspot cycle 25. So expect to see and experience more powerful flares and coronal mass ejection activities as if we needed it as the sun changes its magnetic polar footprint. But George, the big event is happening this Saturday for a good portion of the United States as we get to experience this annular solar eclipse. So let's get set for it. I'll be heading to Albuquerque's International Balloon Fiesta, as I mentioned last week, to appear on stage to view and discuss this rare event as we will be in the shadow of the moon. So 7 western and mid-United States or south central states get to see the experience of the shadow of the moon, the ring of fire. But other portions of the United States get to see a deep partial eclipse of the sun. So obviously we encourage people to use proper eye protection to get set for this eclipse. And one way to help is to go to this particular website for advice, TSE17.com. TSE17.com. Lots of eclipse information available there. And as we talk and close with the live sky, George, obviously so much information about this eclipse around the web. We recommend theskylive.com for your general astronomy information. But for planets, don't miss Jupiter, as we call it the king of the planets, rising in the east around 8 p.m., bright and fantastic in the sky. And if there's a chance you have clear skies, look to the northwest skies on the evening of October the 10th at sunset for possible slow-moving meteors from the annual Draconid meteor shower. What do we say, George? Always mean it. Always remember to keep your eyes to the skies. Emails, we love those too. drsskyshow@gmail.com. Simply, I'm your navigator, and the show's on the highway to the heavens. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sky. Talk to you next week. I love it when legendary talent continues doing what they do best, like the late Tony Bennett did for years and years and years. Well, now at the Coach House in San Juan Capistrano, California, legendary entertainer Pat Boone, celebrating 70 years in show business, will take the stage to sing some of his biggest hits and songs from his new Country Jubilee album. Pat's on the line with us now. He's a fan of the program, and we're a fan of his. Congratulations, Pat. Keep going, my friend.
Thank you, George. Same to you. I think back to some of the times you've brightened my evening so many times over these 70 years. Of course, you weren't along that long ago, but yeah, I know I must be headed to the last roundup. But I'm planning to sing all the songs, the hit songs, the gold record songs that people remember, at least many of them. I can't do them all, but also some of the new songs. And I'm hoping that in this time, maybe it's almost 2 weeks from now, that we can enjoy an evening at least, or a couple of hours of remembrance of happy times, things when the world was going right, and also look to a future, hopefully, when some of these terrible things that are happening now have abated to some degree, hopefully to a large degree. We're in trouble. I know the world is, but we got to keep going anyway. And moments of reflection, moments of happy times and good music, that's what we're going to try to provide at the Coach House.
Go for it, Pat. If you want information on tickets, folks, and go on out and see Pat, because it's going to be coming up on October 21st. It's coming up pretty fast. Go to patboone, BOONE.com. He's got full information there. And, Pat, you wrote the words to the great song Exodus.
Yeah, I did. I wrote the words, "This land is mine, God gave this land to me," to Ernest Gold's melody. That was going to be just an instrumental melody, but I couldn't stand that. I had to write words, I did, and then they became the words, the actual lyrics of what is often considered the second national anthem of Israel. This land is mine. God gave this land to me, echoing the very words of God in the Bible. He promised the land of Canaan, and now then called the land of Israel to the Jews and to Israel, and he intends in the latter days to make it his home again on this earth in Jerusalem. Now, what's happening now is a war between two gods, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Bible, Christians, Jews, America, and also another God called the God of this earth, where those who hate God of the Bible and who hate everything that you and I stand for are battling with the God of heaven and earth. So we're in the middle of a war between two gods, and the answer to the whole dilemma is to pray to the God of the Bible.
Well, I got to tell you, Pat, I hope our God wins this battle, to be sure. Once again, folks, Pat Boone coming back to sing a great event October 21st at the Coach House in San Juan Capistrano, California. Go out and take a look at him. A Russian module on the International Space Station has sprung a coolant leak, the third leak at the ISS in less than a year. The officials say the crew not in danger. Up next, he's back with us, Richard Hoagland, with an incredible story of what's going on with moon rocks right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, George Norrie with you. Richard C. Hoagland back with us, the voice of the other side of midnight, which you can hear by going to theothersideofmidnight.com. Noted author, Dark Mission, The Monuments of Mars, and, of course, the principal investigator and founder of the EnterpriseMission.com. Richard, my friend, welcome back to the program, and thank you for spending your night with us tonight.
Well, thank you, George. You know, it's an incredibly weird world we're living in right now, as Pat Boone said. I mean, he sounds so amazing.
He does.
He
My
sounds
gosh.
exactly like he sounded 50 years ago.
Yeah, he hasn't changed.
And he's still singing.
And my mother has a crush on him.
My mother had one, too.
She's 94, that cougar.
Amazing.
Great.
Amazing.
So how have you been?
Well, I've been incredibly busy. It's almost like while the world is going to hell in a handbasket, we're making some absolutely amazing, astonishing discoveries over here. And it's going to be really hard to compress them into, 2 hours, but I'm going to give it as they used to say, the old college try.
Well, I got to tell you, Avi Loeb, who you're going to talk about in just a moment, was a guest with our George Knapp a few weeks ago. He's an incredible guy. He's a Harvard astronomer, but, man, he is all over the place.
Well, Avi seems to have taken up the reins of something that we've been working on for decades, which is proving from the available evidence that NASA has here on Earth evidence that we are not alone. And, the only evidence the science really can trust, of course, is hard, well-proven, tested, independently tested facts. So tonight I'm going to present what we call the Enterprise Avi Loeb challenge, because we found something so amazingly weird that there's no other way to describe it than it's a discovery whose time has come.
And these discoveries have to do with some lunar material. Tell us how he found out about this. And it's incredible to see someone with a Harvard background, because that gives us added credibility. I mean, you've got credibility, but I mean, to have a Harvard astronomer basically saying some of the things you've been saying for years, that's darn good.
Well, Avi Loeb seems to be the heir apparent to a very ancient Harvard guy who was, at his prime, at the height of the UFO, discussions back in the 1950s and 60s. That was Dr. Donald Menzel.
That's
and then
right.
Much later, my friend and colleague Carl Sagan, who became kind of a well-known worldwide proponent of the idea that we're not alone, but Carl was never able to put forward any real evidence. Well, we've been working for like 40, 50 years on the real evidence, and because I'm not a Harvard astronomer, folks have not been kind of paying much attention, but I think they will now, because I'm basically proposing that Avi and I join forces and prove once and for all that we're not alone, and in fact, the tools are at hand to totally change this really loused up planet for the better. George, I think we're going crazy in every direction. If you look at the news, there is nothing that's normal, nothing that's calm, nothing that's any way, shape, or form the way it used to be. And this latest insanity in the Middle East is just, the last example. I think we're going crazy because we're basically mentally deficient, because we're not alone, but we have not been allowed to know that we're not. And the idea that the human race has brothers and sisters and other family all out there in the galaxy, and we're somehow quarantined, is been driving us nuts. The real long-term solution, I think, to what we're seeing in the Middle East and all kinds of other places is for the government, our government to start with and others to follow, to reveal the evidence that, in fact, the human race is part of a much, much larger tapestry of people of consciousness, of brilliance, of incredible technology, of the ability with that technology to save the Earth by solving all its short-term problems, from, pollution, global warming, to the problems of thermonuclear war itself, and this incredibly persistent problem that, remember that old song, "We always kill the ones we love"?
Yep, great song.
Each other out of desperation and incredibly bad mental health, because I think we've been deliberately kept from knowing who we are. And I'm hoping tonight will be, if nothing else, a major step forward in solving that pernicious, long-term, and if we don't solve it, ultimately fatal problem.
I agree with that. We have to solve it, Richard. We don't have any
we have no choice.
We have no choice at all. We got about a minute or so before the break, but I want to talk with you about Avi Loeb after the break, because in 2014, a blazing meteor entered our atmosphere, and that opened up the floodgates, didn't it?
It certainly did. We've developed a technology, basically the Defense Department, going back to one part of us that perennially has to build all kinds of super weapons and not put resources and money into things that will keep people alive. The U.S. Defense Department has radars all over the planet. And in 2014, it detected an object streaking toward the Earth far in excess of escape velocity, not just from the Earth, but from the Sun. In other words, this object unequivocally was coming in faster than the Sun could even hold it in orbit. Therefore, it had originated somewhere far beyond the solar system. Anyway, it kept coming toward the Earth, very small object, a few meters across, a few tens of feet, and it smashed into the Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean at some extraordinary velocity, I think 35,000 miles per hour, and it crashed through the atmosphere and burned up, and the pieces sank off New Guinea. Well, decades later, Avi Loeb, who has this interesting background and incredibly persistent interest in things extraterrestrial and potentially artificial, he garnered with about $1 million an expedition, went to the Pacific Ocean off New Guinea, lowered what's called a magnetic dredge, meaning a sled on a cable that's highly magnetized. He dragged the bottom of the ocean, and he brought up pieces of this bizarre interloper that had entered the atmosphere, many, many years before.
Tell us what happened after he pulled up those pieces when we come back. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Richard C. Hoagland. So, Richard, Dr. Loeb picked up these meteorite fragments from the bottom of the sea. What did he do with them?
Well, we're talking about fragments that are on the order of little tiny, millimeter-sized droplets. It wasn't like a big rock or a
okay,
rock.
Little really tiny things, microscopic type.
Microscopic, yeah. So he takes them back to Harvard. He's doing all this, he says, under $1 million Harvard grant. I mean, what kind of incredible cutting-edge science can you even begin to do these days for a lousy $1 million, right? $1 million ain't what it used to be. Anyway,
no, that's
so he
true.
takes them back to Harvard, and they had the most incredible state-of-the-art analytical labs with electron microscopes and ion microprobes and, isotope microassessors and, stuff right out of science fiction. And he cuts the little millimeter-sized droplets of whatever he collected, 2 miles down under the Pacific. He puts them on the microscope slide after they are sliced into little tiny sections by microscopic diamond saws, which is what, geologists do with rocks and samples these days. In fact, they've been doing it for decades. And when he looks and does the microprobe analysis, which allows him to look at different parts of what's called the thin section, the metallic composition of these little tiny droplets that came in from deep outer space in excess of 30,000 miles per hour, not part of the sun's family at all, turn out to be the most bizarre meteoritic fragments that any scientist anywhere in the world for any time ever has ever analyzed. Because they're obviously, according to their composition, not from this star. They're not from this sun. They're not from this solar system, and they're not natural. That's the huge thing, George. They cannot be natural because they turned out to be iron, lithium, beryllium, titanium, and other exotic metals in a weird exotic mix that simply does not exist anywhere in our solar system or in any of the models projected for any other solar system. They look like they're made of an artificial material or combination of materials that once was part of some kind of ancient alien spaceship.
That blew up instead of a meteorite.
Well, it burned up in the atmosphere, but it lasted longer, by the way, even at that incredible velocity, than the tiny little meteors that you see in the night sky that kind of flash across the sky and then are gone. Whatever this thing was, it survived almost until the ocean, and then the melted rain of molten droplets fell into the Pacific, fell 2 miles down, and Loeb was able to pick up a few fragments and prove that whatever this thing was, it was not A, from Earth, B, from the solar system, or C, it wasn't even natural. And you know who kind of provided the final linchpin in the analysis?
Would that be you?
No. Our old friend Dr. John Brandenburg, nuclear physicist, was at the Los Alamos National Lab for many years, became part of my independent Mars investigation decades ago at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. Anyway, I had John on the other side of midnight the other night. He has just published a peer-reviewed paper in an Indian science journal. Came out, I think, about a week ago. John's conclusion, not Loeb's now, John Brandenburg's conclusion, based on his unique scientific background, is that not only did Loeb pick up something that is artificial, but it was something that either was, and wait for it, a nuclear weapon.
Oh, my God.
Now melted hopelessly into little teeny tiny droplets, or part of some nuclear ancient spaceship's atomic drive, space drive, propulsion system that had been sent to the solar system from another star because of the unique combination of elements that are never found in nature, including uranium.
That's interesting. So definitely not biological.
Oh, not biological at all, but what they're calling these days, I love how science goes through these phases. Do you know what ET artifacts are called now in the general scientific community as it's becoming more and more credible at Warp 9?
What do they call them?
They're called techno-signatures. Technological signatures. Well, that's a pretty good term. Anyway, Brandenburg has proven not only that Loeb is correct, these are techno-signatures from somebody, but they're techno-signatures with a isotopic ratio demonstrating that they probably could only have come from some kind of very high-tech, ancient nuclear device used by someone either to get here or a weapon system that's been coming toward the sun for eons and in the summer of 2014 smashed into the earth, destroyed itself, and left pieces for Avi Loeb to pick up.
Interesting. Now, was there any tie-in between Loeb's discovery and what you discovered a long time ago with the rocks that the astronauts brought back from the moon?
Absolutely. That's where, life is weird. There's convergences, there's resonances, there's all kinds of synchronistic patterns. Well, I looked at Loeb's data, and I agree with John that A, it's artificial, and B, the only reasonable explanation is it's some kind of ancient nuclear device. But it wasn't until I realized that we had almost 1,000 pounds on Earth of the same kind of extraterrestrial samples. I mean, imagine what the science he was able to do on microscopic fragments just a few millimeters in diameter, smaller than, BVs. Remember BVs?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the samples he was analyzing were the size of BBs. What if you had 10,000 times as much material to analyze and it hadn't been melted and destroyed, but was in some kind of original geometry?
Still intact.
Almost intact. What could you do with today's almost magical, godlike science and analytical instrumentation? So I began looking on the NASA websites, because they're all over the world, at what are called the thin sections of some of the moon rocks, the 842 pounds of moon rocks that the agency brought back from the moon. And I could not believe what I'm finding, and those images are listed by Lex in the photographic section of tonight's website, so you'll tell everybody how to go there, because we have to do this visually from here on.
Folks, you just go to the Coast to Coast website, look under Richard's name, and there will be a link to these photos that he has sent us. They're right there, coasttocoastam.com. But what does this tell you, Richard? What does this tell you?
Well, when I started looking at the moon rocks, and if you look at your photo number 4, you'll see a photograph of the one of the moon rocks brought back in the Lunar Receiving Laboratory that was set up in Houston to analyze the rocks 50 years ago. And as you can see from that sample sitting on the scale, what they do is they thin section them, meaning they take little diamond saws and they slice them into little, like, wafers that are thinner than, a poker chip by a factor of probably 100 times. And when you slice any kind of material, including rocks, thin enough, they become transparent. You can shine light through them. So then what they do is they put them on a microscope stand, they illuminate them, and that's where you get microphotograph number 5. Number 5 of my items. This is from Apollo 16. The first example that I went to the NASA website and looked at, and lo and behold, in the microscopic thin sections from just one rock from one lunar mission, weighing, a few millionths of an ounce, look at the geometry in that thin section of photograph number 5. What do you see in the upper left-hand corner?
Well, now you tell me.
Well, it's not a crystal. It's not a natural melt crystal. It's not a normal, natural mineral configuration. It's like nothing that I've ever seen in any rock thin sliced anywhere here on Earth. It looks like a fragment of some kind of mechanical circuit or machine or manufactured device, including wires, which have melted partially at the very end against the white background of what we call that inclusion to the bottom left of the geometric orange-looking thing in the upper left-hand corner.
Looks like it fell off some robot or something, doesn't it?
Exactly. That's not a rock.
No, that's not a rock.
That's a fragment of a piece of a machine. So I began thinking, oh my God, how could I have been so dumb for all the decades, George, that you and I have been talking, that Art and I were talking, that the audience and I have been talking, because as I looked at these samples, like number 2, look at number 6, right below it, all right? Blow it up, and you click on them, they get much bigger. What do you see in the middle of sample number 6?
Strange pink pieces of stuff.
And below that, look closely.
That's that little brown thing?
No, the elongated
pieces
things.
They're all over the place.
They're machines. You can see the geometry. You can see the little micro dots. You can see artificial, mechanical-looking signatures as you look at these moon samples over and over and over. This was just random. We've got 842 pounds of this stuff on Earth, or NASA does, locked up in the vaults under Houston. These are just a few millionths of a pound of material picked totally at random because, a couple of weeks ago when I started doing this, I had no idea what I should look at, what I was looking for, et cetera, et cetera. And, then look at my third example. Look at image number 7, all right? Look in the right-hand section of that image. Don't be distracted by the colors. Look at the shapes and geometries. We have flat things, we have broken things, we have cylinders, we have pipe-like looking things, all in a jumble. Remember, this is a three-dimensional set of objects in a two-dimensional slice, so the saw has cut through on both sides a much bigger set of objects to get us these fragments.
And these are just laying on the surface of the moon?
They're just laying on the surface of the moon. Now, let me tell you why this is absolutely crucial. Moon rocks, most moon rocks, unlike rocks on Earth, are not formed from original melts or original lava or original crystallization. The moon, as you know, has been bombarded by meteorites for billions of years. And the repeated bombardment, big craters are smashed into by littler objects that create smaller craters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been going on for an amount of time that human beings can't even begin to imagine. The sum total of all that smashing and impacting and shock waves and heat and melting and refreezing and melting again and more shock waves is that the lunar soil, which experts call the regolith, can vary in depth from a few inches to tens of feet all over the moon. So what the astronauts were able to pick up, the most common type of rock all over the moon, is what scientists call a breccia, which is a technical term meaning a smashed together rock. It's like a fusion of fragments from, hundreds or thousands of other rocks in the history of the moon exposed to meteorites that's been bombarded and smashed and bombarded again and again and again and again.
Now, Richard, if you propose to work with Avi Loeb and he turns you down, then what do you do?
Well, will tell us who Avi Loeb is, because if I was the real scientist that I think Avi is, and I'd gone to the lengths to discuss the ET interstellar origins of Oumuamua, and I want to come back to Oumuamua later in the morning, and then I was shown this and the fact that it's literally sitting in public domain, samples carefully archived by NASA a half a century ago, and most of it still has not been touched by human tongs or human instrumentation. It's been carefully saved by NASA in their forward-looking thinking from half a century ago to where instrumentation would evolve better techniques than existed in the 60s and 70s that were used to analyze these rocks initially.
We're going to come back with final discussions with Richard C. Hoagland in our final hour. We'll open up the phone lines with calls, time permitting, when we come back.